In a world overflowing with opinions, misinformation, and viral myths, scientific reasoning stands as one of our most powerful tools for uncovering truth. It's not just about lab coats and test tubes, it's a disciplined way of thinking, observing, questioning, testing, revising, and never settling for easy answers. Scientific reasoning demands evidence, welcomes skepticism, and thrives on curiosity. It's how we separate what we wish were true from what is true. But how does this way of thinking intersect with philosophy, ethics, and the big questions about consciousness, morality, and existence? In this special episode of Sunny Spot, we sit down with philosopher and critical thinking champion Dr. David Kyle Johnson to explore how scientific reasoning shapes our understanding.
So, what have you been up to since you were last on the show?
Well, kind of two big things I've been up to. One I want to talk about tonight. The other we will, I'm sure, come back and talk about later. The one we'll come and talk about later is I recorded another course for the Great Courses, the teaching company. I did an updated version of my metaphysics course, 30 lectures on metaphysics. So a little philosophy of mind, a little personal identity, does God exist, quantum mechanics, relativity, do we live in a computer simulation? Really, really fun stuff. And interesting stuff. So I'm sure I'll come back and talk about that whenever it's getting close to release. But I recorded this summer, they're editing and all that stuff, and that should be out soon. The other thing that I want to talk about tonight is the book I'm working on right now called How, Why, and When to Think Scientifically. It is a book that was inspired by a need at King's College where I teach. There is it's called the Scientific Endeavors course. That's supposed to teach non-science majors basically two things, among other things, but basically two things: how to examine scientific research critically, right? Like, not like they're not science majors, so not like a science major would need to, right? But, competence out in the real world to be able to look at science and understand science and scientific reasoning and look at studies and understand whether you should be convinced by scientific evidence or not. And then how to recognize pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm.
And I already teach a class on pseudoscience, but I teach it for the philosophy department. It's a pseudoscience and medicine class. And I teach that as a philosophy class. So it's more kind of an epistemology class. There's some ethics in it as well. So it's not the same kind of class, but I have pretty good luck getting students to recognize pseudoscience in that class. And the people who were teaching scientific endeavors were expressing frustration to me about their class on two fronts. One, they didn't have a book. They didn't have a single book that pulled everything they wanted to do in the course together in one place. They'd have to kind of hodgepodge from different places and that kind of stuff. And Christy, I think, just got rid of a book and she just did everything lecture. She just taught everything in the classroom. And it was hard and difficult. And then secondly, I've had other professors for a long time. They've just complained about how students still don't seem to understand how to recognize pseudoscience, right? So they'll take this class and they'll still believe in Bigfoot or, fall for medical pseudoscience or whatever, right? And, they can examine scientific, evidence, and they can look at, scientific research and stuff like that in a pretty decent way. But pseudoscience was still getting past the filter, right? And so I kind of volunteered to try something out. I said I could attempt to write a book that would be for the course that could try to accomplish both of those goals and would put everything you need in the course into one place. And so that could be usable. And so I promised to do that a while back, and then Great Courses came and said, "Do you want to redo this course?" And so I kind of had to set it aside for a bit. But then I was able to get back to it, and I completed it in April or May. And it was at the publisher, and we're trying out a trial version of the book right now. So the first day of class was yesterday. And we're trying out a trial version of the book this semester to see how it works. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I've taken a particular kind of approach that I kind of want to talk about that I think is good for accomplishing both of those goals. But I also think that will be very applicable to a general audience. Like, it's eventually going to be up on Amazon, and I'm hoping the general audience can use this, because I'm kind of writing it kind of not like a textbook. So in other words, like, for example, there are no exercises in the book, but at the end of each chapter, there's a QR code. You can go to that and it takes you to the exercises. But
Oh, that's cool.
if I could make it into an audiobook, you could just read it straight through like an audiobook, right? Or you could just read it like a regular book or whatever, and just go from chapter to chapter, and not have to pay extra money for pages of exercises and that kind of stuff, right? I'm also putting a number of like extra resources online, linking to other stuff I've written, stuff I'm going to write. And again, QR code, just right in the book, boom, takes you right to the article. If you want to know more about a particular subject, or I'm going to have a bunch of extra chapters that aren't in the print book on like UFOs and Shroud of Turin and medical pseudoscience and that kind of stuff. So like uh, again, we're testing it right now. We'll see how it goes when we get day in. So who knows? I've got a biggest challenge probably get the students to actually read the book. I feel like if they do, I think we can actually accomplish our goals. But I've taken a particular kind of approach that I can tell you about. But that's the two major projects I've been working on.
Okay, awesome. It makes me think as you're talking about that. There was, oh, what is that one? He was Randy. That's his name, Randy. Uh,
Oh, James Randi.
James Randy. Thank you, thank you. Um, that did a experiment kind of a thing, or well, actually, it was a scam. But he was putting forward, or he had. Okay, I'm gonna totally
Project
butcher
Alpha.
this. Project Alpha. Yes.
So funny you should mention this. This is the anecdote that opens the book. So
Awesome.
I start chapter 1 by talking about Project Alpha, and how the people at MacLab were trying to study ESP, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the way the book tells it is like, so this kind of sets up the whole premise of the book here. So I'm so glad you brought this up, Sonny. So it tells a story about how MacLab was wanting to test ESP. And what they just want to do like crank stuff. They want to do it in a controlled scientific, and you had like an Oxford and Stanford scientist or whatever, like, big wigs, who were doing it. And I forget their names right off the top of my head. I could bring up chapter 1, but they, and they were wanting to do it in a really controlled fashion. And so they did, and they had these two guys that really stood out, right? And they did these, what they thought were really rigorous experiments under their, scientific protocols. And they were physicists from, Stanford or whatever, like, they were really good, scientists or whatever. And they were like, we got this. We can't be fooled. These people are doing this stuff, and we're controlling, and we're, doing this thing. And they seem to be able to do all of these kinds of things. And like they concluded that they had ESP, and they were going to announce it to the world. I'm simplifying a bit here, but they were going to announce it to the world. And James Randi shows up and says, haha, gotcha. They don't have ESP or magic powers. They're doing simple magic tricks, right? And he did this not to be mean, but when MacLab first started to do this, Randy wrote them a letter and said, great, I encourage you to do this. This is a great thing to do, but I'm a professional at this. I know how people who don't have ESP but are really good at pretending that they do, how they can fool people, how they can, get right past controls and that kind of stuff. Here are the kinds of protocols that you need to do to make sure that you're not fooled by people who are doing simple, conjuring tricks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically the people at MacLab said, screw you, you're a magician, we're scientists, we don't need you, right? And so they just completely ignored him. And so he's like, well, I'm going to prove a point. I'm going to prove that as, physicists and that kind of stuff does not make you automatically immune from this kind of stuff, right? You're not going to be able to detect this kind of stuff. So he trained two young guys to do really simple magic tricks, and they went in there and fooled them for like, a couple of years to the point that they were completely convinced. And then Randy exposed, like, see, I told you, you needed these protocols. You completely got fooled, right? And so the reason I mentioned that story up front is to kind of justify why the title of the book is How, Why, and When to Think Scientifically, not how to think like a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Because scientists very often aren't thinking scientifically, especially when they're thinking about something outside of their own discipline. So inside their discipline, if they're a physicist, they're pretty good at doing the physics, and they're pretty good at, that kind of stuff, because they've been trained in that particular area. And so this kind of automatically, well, this is how you control and this is how you do. But they only kind of know that. It's very limited, right? And so when they try to think scientifically about something else, those skills don't transfer. And the reason I think, and so this kind of teaches the approach of the book, the reason I think this is the case is because scientists and science textbooks do this, scientists do this, conceive of the scientific method as the experimental method. In other words, if you ask a scientist what is the scientific method, they will say something like, you observe, from those observations, you have a problem, you have a question comes up, and so you make a hypothesis, and then you make predictions based on that hypothesis, and so you test that hypothesis with an experiment, and then based on the results of the experiment, you either revise or reject the hypothesis. And it's this four-step: observe, hypothesize, test, revise, or reject. Like that's the scientific method, right? And while those four steps are definitely involved in scientific reasoning, that is not the scientific method. That does not exhaust the scientific method, and it is neither necessary nor sufficient for the scientific method. So, example, it's not sufficient for the scientific method. Example, I have an illness. That's my observation. I form a hypothesis. This pill will cure my illness. So I test the hypothesis. I take the pill, see if I get better. And then I do get better. And so I conclude the pill cured my illness. It's a cure for whatever symptom I had or whatever, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. I followed the 4 steps. But anybody knows anything about science knows I was not thinking scientifically, right? Correlation, time and tail causation. I did not control. I didn't Like there's a billion things that I didn't do. That means that is not scientific reasoning. It's certainly not good scientific reasoning, right? So following the 4 steps is not sufficient for scientific reasoning, right? In addition, following the 4 steps is not necessary for scientific reasoning. I can reason scientifically without doing those 4 steps. Some kind of easy examples are like when astronomers look at distant stars and they measure the wavelengths of the light and come to conclusions about what elements are in the star. You're not doing those 4 steps, right? You're observing, but you're not forming like you're just observing, and then you're deducing what elements are there, or inducing what elements are there based on what the light waves are showing, right? Like what frequency of light are there, right? That's not really an experiment in the kind of revise or reject, like did my prediction come out correct kind of way, right? When evolutionary theorists are looking at fossil records, right? They're just putting fossils together and inferring hypotheses about how things evolved or whatever, but they're not doing a test on it in that kind of way. Yet they're still thinking scientifically. Here's my favorite, and I'm going to simplify a bit. I'm going to caveat this a little bit. I'm going to make this a little bit oversimple. A lot more historically accurate version of what I'm about to say is in the book in detail, but for the sake of the podcast, I'm going to simplify the historical theory a bit here, the historical story a bit here. Geocentrism and heliocentrism. All right. So again, I'm simplifying, but roughly speaking, when they started competing with each other, geocentrism and heliocentrism, there was no observational way to test which one was correct, because we knew about epicycles already, and geocentrism already accounted for those epicycles, right? Geocentrism had the Earth in the center, and it has the planets going around the Earth, I'm not doing that right, going around the Earth with epicycles, right? And so that's why Mars will occasionally backtrack on its course in the sky every now and again, and all the planets do this, right? Well, you can account for that with heliocentrism, the planets going around the sun, and if both Mars and Earth are going around the sun, right, we end up like passing Earth in our orbit, and that causes it to retrograde. So you can account for that same thing. So essentially, you've got geocentrism and heliocentrism telling you the same thing about where the planets will be in the night sky every night, right? And so there's no way to observationally delineate between heliocentrism and geocentrism, because the observational predictions that they make are the same. They tell you the same thing about where the planets are going to be. So it's not like I can say one's true and the other one's false, because this one says Mars will be here, this one says Mars will be there. They both say the same thing about where Mars is, so there's no way to differentiate them, right? And yet we came to accept heliocentrism over geocentrism, despite the fact that we couldn't delineate between them observationally, based on simplicity. It was just a better theory because it was more parsimonious. There were fewer assumptions in it, and so it was less likely to be wrong, right? It was more likely to be correct because there were less ways that it could go wrong. Does that make sense?
Right? Yep, absolutely.
But the historical theory is that was the case for a bit. Galileo got his telescope out and noticed that Jupiter had moons and Venus had phases, and so that kind of messed up the original geocentric theory. But then they went with Tycho Brahe's geocentrism, which had the sun and moon going around the earth, and then the planets going around the sun as it orbited there. So it's still a different version of geocentrism, but that could account for Jupiter having moons and Venuses. And so then you had those two theories that kind of modified geocentrism and heliocentrism that were making exactly the same predictions, and there was no observational way to delineate between them. In fact, here's an even more interesting thing. So there wasn't an observational way to delineate between them easily. There technically was a way to delineate between them, and that was to observe parallax. Parallax is the phenomenon on if the sun's the center and the earth is going around it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then let's say there's a distant star, a pair of stars very distant, right? If we're on this side of the earth of the sun at one time of the year and this on the other, and there's a distant star pair, they should look slightly different at different times of year, right? They should move a little bit different as we're moving relative to them. Does that make sense? There should be some movement in star pairs. It's called parallax, right? So, but if geocentrism is right and we're in the middle and the sun's going around us, distant stars shouldn't change. You shouldn't be able to observe parallax, right? So observing parallax would be direct confirmation of heliocentrism and a refutation of geocentrism, right? Well, we looked for parallax and we didn't see it, just as geocentrism predicted. And yet, we still came to favor heliocentrism over geocentrism, despite the fact that heliocentrism didn't get its prediction right. Like, we ran the experiment, we made the observation, we formed the hypothesis, we did the experiment to see if heliocentrism was right by looking for parallax, and it failed. We couldn't see parallax. And yet we didn't reject the theory. Well, they're thinking unscientifically. They're not following the 4 steps. No, they're relying on other scientific criteria. The simplicity of heliocentrism was so monumentally, that's the word I'm looking for, persuasive, so important that it allowed them to rationally and scientifically say, well, probably the reason we're not seeing parallax is because those stars are probably a lot further away than we think, and our telescopes aren't powerful enough yet, right? And eventually we did see parallax in like the late 1800s. I think maybe 1860 something. I forget exactly what the year is. But we eventually did see it. But heliocentrism was already accepted for like 100 years before we eventually saw the observational evidence of parallax that confirmed it, which shows you that scientific reasoning isn't just hypothesize, test. Like, that's really important to science. I'm not trying to degrade it. But that's not all of scientific reasoning. There's other things that are involved, like appealing to other criteria like simplicity or parsimony, fewest assumptions makes it more likely. Scope or explanatory power, the more something explains, the more likely it is. Fruitfulness, in the sense of, so there's novel predictive accuracy. If you get the experimental, you make a prediction based on the experiment, you get that right, that's novel predictive accuracy. But I delineate that in the book from what's called fruitfulness. The more a hypothesis or a theory generates new knowledge and encourages new discovery and like basically becomes a kind of fruitful mode of inquiry, the more we discover because we accept that theory, that's another reason to think that a theory is true. And also what's called conservatism, the more it aligns with things that we already have good reason to believe. And so my argument is that, and I'm borrowing this argument from Ted Schick, a book I probably talked about before, How to Think About Weird Things, one of my absolute favorite books. And he argues this as well. That, and I'm also pulling from another guy named Ernest McMullen, who has a book called The Inference That Makes Science. And he uses a different word. He calls it retroduction, but I call it inference of the best explanation. My argument is that what all scientific reasoning has in common, whether you're using experiment or not, is all science is an attempt to figure out what the best explanation for some phenomenon is, right? And when we do that, we use basically 6 criteria. Is the hypothesis testable? Or is the hypothesis an explanation I'm using interchangeably? But is it testable, right? Does it make novel predictions? Does it get those predictions right? Novel predictive accuracy. Does it generate new knowledge? And is it fruitful in that kind of way of leading to new discoveries and that kind of stuff? Scope, explanatory power. How much does it unify? How much does it explain, unify our knowledge? Does it make unanswerable assumptions or raise unanswerable questions or that kind of stuff? Parsimony, does it make numerous extra assumptions, right? Which would include like extra entities and that kind of stuff that you have to suppose exist. And then conservatism, does it align with things that we already have good reason to believe? And what scientists are ultimately doing is looking at different hypotheses and comparing them according to those criteria to figure out which one is the best. Now, where experimentation comes in is figuring out which one has more predictive accuracy, and sometimes fruitfulness as well, like they're kind of related there, right? So and those are really, really important. So experimentation is very, very important in science, but it's not all of science. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason that I think this is so helpful is because I think that this is why you can teach a course about scientific reasoning, but if you're only talking about the experimental method, you can end up with students who can like examine some basic scientific evidence, but they still fall for pseudoscience because they're not really in a position to do an experiment to tell whether Bigfoot is real or do an experiment to tell whether UFOs, the thing I saw in the sky was a UFO, was an alien craft, or was it something else, right? You can't really like do an experiment on those kind of things because they're not something you can really do in a lab, right? But I can apply the criteria of adequacy. I can think, okay, I saw that thing. I don't know what it was. What's the simplest explanation? What's the most parsimonious explanation? What's the explanation that coheres best with what we already have good reason to
Mm-hmm.
believe, right? What aligns with theories that are fruitful, et cetera, right? And once I understand that that's what I should be doing, I should be trying to find the best explanation. I understand scientifically how to do that. Then I'll have to run an experiment to be able to figure out, oh, that thing I couldn't explain in the sky. The most likely was not actually an alien craft, right? There's other better explanations for that. If nothing else, my own ignorance would be a better explanation, right? I can't figure out what it was or whatever, right? But that's what I think can generate students who can do both things, be able to examine scientific evidence, but also not fall for pseudoscience. And so ultimately, the book's trying to teach that kind of inference to the best explanation method.
That's fantastic. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about when I was in college. I'm working on, my thesis, and um, I have a degree in psychology, so I'm not a physicist or anything like that. But the thing about psychology is that it was considered a pseudoscience for a very long time
Mm.
until they began to incorporate the scientific method and scientific reasoning into psychology. That's really what changed it. And one thing that we learned was that it wasn't just that you take what you observe and you have to extrapolate as well. Make sure that you're getting multiple factors like you were talking about, but you also have to look at the tools that you're using. And for instance, if you're doing a questionnaire or something along those lines to try to collect data, how you formulate those questions can inject bias
Mm-hmm.
into your study itself. And so you also have to look at how you're doing the test, the study, how you're presenting it. You have to try to remove as much bias as you can from yourself and as much bias as you can from others. That is where psychology has a harder time because we can't peel people's brains apart and while they're still living
Right.
and try to figure out their psychological processes. So as you're talking, I'm wondering, with scientific reasoning, do you think that it's also kind of incorporating critical thinking skills, and the things that we learn about bias and unintentional um, factors that can go in that you may not even think about when you're doing your experiments?
Yes, 100%. For one thing, I kind of consider scientific thinking and critical thinking to kind of go hand in hand. In addition, I think that, like, again, as I've described the scientific method, it is this, but also the experimental method is this. Like, if not just the four steps, but when you fully understand how to implement those four steps, like if you think like a placebo-controlled trial or something like that, right? What it's designed to do is to guard against those biases, to guard
Right.
against all the different ways that we can lead ourselves astray cognitively with
Mm-hmm.
like cognitive biases, or we can lead ourselves astray logically by committing logical fallacies, how we can lead ourselves astray by misperceiving the world, how we can lead ourselves astray by misremembering what happened. Good science, right, whenever it's done in a controlled, rigorous way, will guard against all those different things: cognitive biases, logical fallacies, perceptual mistakes, and memory mistakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some other things too. I'm probably leaving out or whatever. but it absolutely has to do that. And so that's why, like, so the book again is called How, When, and Why to Think
Mm-hmm.
Scientifically. The why part is actually what leads, that opens the book, right? And the second chapter is why do we need to think scientifically? Because it's really dangerous if we don't. Like, there's really bad consequences that, if you don't,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, you put idiots who don't understand science in charge of national health or something like that, and you'll end up seeing what happens. Um, in particular, I talk about Lysenkoism, which is in Stalin's Russia. He put a pseudoscientist in charge of like crops and in charge of farming, and the guy didn't believe in
Yes.
evolution or genes, and just like, I mean, killed millions of people by starving
Yes.
them to death because he didn't know what he was doing, right? And some people think that RFK will be worse, so because he has the potential to kill a lot more people with his
Oh,
pseudoscience. Um,
absolutely. Absolutely.
so there's more people to kill, and he's messing with things that are even more dangerous than starving people. So, um, but it's important for that reason. But then I also say it's important why we need to reason, why we need to learn to think scientifically, is because we're not good at it natively, right? So
Yeah.
like we think that we can just like look at stuff and figure it out with my own native cognitive abilities. No, you can't. You got all these cognitive biases that you're not aware of that are going to influence how you draw conclusions. They're going to lead you astray. You have this instinctive reasoning in you that's going to lead you to logical fallacies, right? You're going to correlation
Right.
tells causation and straw man fallacies and begging the question. And like you can make all of these logical mistakes. You think seeing is believing, and it's not. Your perception leads you astray way more often than you think than you realize that it does. You think
Mm-hmm.
if you remembered something, it must have happened that way. Your memory is way more fallible than you think it is, right? And so we have to learn scientifically to guard against all of those things. That's a big part of the why we need to think
Mm-hmm.
scientifically, is because we don't do it naturally. We have to learn how to do it, and it's something that you have to practice. Otherwise, you won't be getting good at it, just like you won't be good at anything else if you don't practice it and learn the basics of like the basic skills
Mm-hmm.
go with it. It's not something that happens natively. And so, yeah, so that's, I mean, so psychology gets better when it starts incorporating those things and recognizing those things and is able to guard against them, right, in a better way.
Right.
What makes it a soft science, supposed to a hard science like physics or whatever, is it's harder to control for those kinds of things because sometimes it can be harder to blind things or whatever than it is like in a physics experiment or something like
Right.
that. But that's not to say that it can't be done, right? And it's not to say that physics always gets it right either, right? So there's all kinds of mistakes that have been made in physical experiments and that kind of stuff. And it has to do with like, in a similar kind of way, like whenever you were talking about the way you structure your questions can introduce
Right.
bias and that kind of stuff, right? So one of the reasons, another kind of argument I give in the book for why the 4 steps don't exhaust the entire scientific method is when you do the test and the hypothesis doesn't come out right, you have this revise or reject option, right? So you might reject it, but it also might be the case that the reason the prediction didn't come out right is because there was something wrong with your measuring device,
Right.
right? And so, like, how do you figure out whether or not a negative result indicates the hypothesis is false or that the experimental setup was malfunctioning, right? Again, there's nothing in those 4 steps that tells you how to do that. There's stuff in scientific reasoning in general that can tell you how to do that, right? Whether it's an
Mm-hmm.
outlier, a outlier that can be dismissed, or whether it's really indicative of an actual data point that should be falsified the hypothesis. But again, that's not in the 4 steps. In the same kind of way, it's kind of like whenever you're doing psychology and you have questions that might introduce biases, you get a result you don't expect. It's like, well, is the hypothesis false or were the questions bad? Was my
Mm-hmm.
measuring device essentially, right? But again,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to ask those kind of questions, and those aren't how to ask those questions and how to answer them are not contained in the 4 steps, and therefore there's a lot more to scientific reasoning than just those 4 steps.
Absolutely. I can't seem to pull up the comments, but so I'm going to ask Wes. What was her name? I want to, because it flew up. Karen Butcher had a question earlier, and if you can find it, um, how do we account for scientist bias on what we test, and how such as women can't do science and math? Now that was along with I was what we were just talking about, but I wanted to bring it up because she brought up a really good point. There was, and for some there still is, a this idea that women or minorities or so forth have different abilities because of either brain mass. Like that was a big one way back in the days that they hypothesized that brain mass was different and so forth. So how do we account for that type of stuff when we're talking about things like gender, race, those type of things? How would you get people to think in a scientifically reasoned manner when it comes to things like that?
Okay, so I think I understand the question here. So, and I'm not up on my research on this particular topic,
Hmm.
but if memory serves, and again, memory can be faulty. But I'm pretty sure that there is. I know that there's solid research that there's no difference between the races in terms of being able to do these kinds of things,
Hmm.
and I'm very confident there's not a difference in genders in being able to do these kind of things either. And that the only kind of apparent differences in like outcomes that exist are due to like educational factors and societal factors. In other words,
Right.
it was the white men who had access to the education because they rigged the system in their favor and yada yada. And so, generally speaking, like this is why all the old scientists from the 19th century and 20th century were all white males, mostly white males or whatever,
Hmm.
because society was structured to give them those kind of advantages and that kind of stuff, right? So that can leave people with the impression that they're the ones that know how to do that stuff, but it's just the people of different races and genders did not have the opportunity to be so educated because white men controlled the society. I'm being oversimplistic, but that's roughly what's going on there, right? And it certainly is the case is that as educational opportunities have improved for both non-white male races and genders, you've
Hmm.
seen just as much ability for them to be able to do that kind of research and think science, to do science and math, right? To do the two things that are mentioned in the question there, right? And notice that there the conclusion that white men are better at such things is itself an unscientific conclusion because it mistakes correlation with causation, right? Like
Right.
it's
Yes.
this classic kind of like, oh yeah, there's this correlation between a bunch of people who do math and a whole bunch of white males, therefore there must be a causal link. It's like, no, there's a third factor that's right. The third factor there
Hmm.
that's getting you that result, and it's not the genetics and it's not the it's not the gender, right? And so what was I'm sorry, I got distracted there for a second. So it's not there's and so in the same kind of way that like like easy example I use in the book, right, is that ice cream sales and violent crime each year go up and down together, like in sync, right? One does not cause the other. It's just they both peak in the summer, right, when there's longer days and people are out more. There's a third causal factor there that you're neglecting or whatever. It's the same kind of mistake with that kind of reasoning.
Hmm.
So hopefully that answers your question. Is that the kind of thing that you were?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're absolutely right. There are the other thing that we have to remember is sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so there's so many other factors that can come into play, which is, in my opinion, one of the great things about reasoning scientifically is that you recognize that you only have so much that you can see and know, which is why you always want to have as many additional testing of the same thing
Mm-hmm.
from different scientists or whatever, across the board, so that you have a bigger sample size, a bigger data set. You have people who have different biases than you do, or who think in a different manner than you do, so you can end up incorporating all of those things into a bigger body of work instead of
Right.
looking at one single study or one single source or one single set of data.
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about replication and why it's needed. And one of the biggest reasons is that it's you even whenever you do a double-blind placebo-controlled trial or whatever, like you
Mhm.
take all the controls that you need to do, it's still possible for biases to slip in consciously, unconsciously, whatever. It's less likely for those same biases to creep into another study that's done in exactly the same way. And so if you do it 3 or 4 times and you get the same result every time, that's a really good reason for thinking that there aren't biases in there, right? So, but you
Right.
do that to guard against biases, right? Because they can slip into even really, really well controlled, But
Hmm.
also, you need a broader perspective. You need more people, and this is also something I talk about. I have a whole chapter in the book about how to treat authority in science. and how to gain scientific knowledge through authority. Because people like, okay, people like RFK who disagree with the experts will say things like, well, scientific reasoning doesn't defer to experts because scientific reasoning thrives on challenge, right? So it's, Galileo challenges the establishment and Einstein challenges the establishment. And that's how science progresses. And so you can't take the fact that like there's a consensus in science or the fact that an expert says anything in the scientific field or whatever as a reason to believe it's true, because science always progresses with challenge or whatever. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how science works, right? I mean, basically, this is just the Galileo gambit, right? They laugh at Galileo and he was right. You're laughing at me, so I must be right too. You're more likely, they're laughing at you because you're Bozo the Clown. That's a lot more likely than if they're Galileo, right? Galileo had something you don't have, evidence and, good scientific reasoning and that kind of stuff, right?
A brain without a worm, sorry.
Right, not a brainworm, right? So, but like, the problem is that like, when we look at experts, we have to realize that we have to, because we can't study everything, right? Our perspective is limited, and literally like the amount of the world that we can see and the amount of scientific knowledge we can gain for ourselves is extremely limited because we're just one person. So if we never listen to experts or defer to experts and let them, like when they do the experiments that I read in a book and then I can believe, I would be able to hardly have any scientific knowledge at all because I can't do it all myself, not even close, right? So you have to defer to experts. And in doing so, you have to recognize that they know more than you. They have more experience than you in that particular topic, whatever their expertise is in or whatever, right? And so it's more rational to believe what they say, and especially when you get a consensus, right? It's not, and some people will claim that like, oh, that's just the bandwagon fallacy. A whole bunch of people believe something, and so you think it's true. Well, that's the bandwagon fallacy. So a bunch of scientists believe something true, and you're going to believe it's true. That's the bandwagon fallacy. No, that is not the bandwagon fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy just refers to like, a whole bunch of people just randomly everywhere believe a particular kind of thing. Therefore, it's true. That's fallacious because crowds, right? Untrained crowds, and unexpertise crowds can believe all kinds of things for all really bad reasons, right? Groupthink, they have logical fallacies. They can be convinced by bad evidence, right? Cult thinking, all kinds of different reasons. There are a lot of different ways for a hypothesis to come to a consensus in just a regular crowd that have nothing to do with the truth. Right?
Yep, absolutely.
But scientific consensus has not gotten that way, right? It's not groupthink. It's like they look at the evidence, they go through the experiments, they look at the evidence, and they come to, and if a whole bunch of different people, all trained in expertise, all look at the evidence and they all come to the same conclusion, that's a really good reason for thinking that it's true, right? So Bertrand Russell said that, if the experts say that there's not enough grounds for a conclusion, then you should just say, I don't know. If the experts disagree, so half say this, half say that, you could side with one side or the other, but you really can't say that you really know, like definitely what is true. But if the scientists are all agreed, what Russell says is the layperson cannot say that they know better, right? He kind of thinks that you could still be free to disagree with the experts, but you can't say that you know better than the experts. I would take it a step further. If all the experts agree that something is the case and you're not an expert in that field, you probably ought to believe that that's the case, or at least somewhere close to the case, right? They're onto something. It may be wrong in a couple of different aspects or whatever. It may be slightly revised over time, but it's basically right. And this is something else I talk about in the book about how science, another argument against trusting science is, why would you believe anything science says today? It's just going to be overturned in 10 years and they'll believe something else. Science is just flipping one theory for another and what we believed in the past. If you look at the history of science, that is not how it works.
Right.
It is very rare for a scientific theory that actually gains scientific consensus because of the evidence to be completely overturned and flipped around and a whole new theory comes in, right? Most of the time, it's slow incremental progress that like the theory gets tweaked a little bit and tweaked a little bit more, gets a little bit more accurate and a little bit more accurate. The best example of this is heliocentrism, right? So geocentrism was completely overturned and we went to heliocentrism. But geocentrism was never based on good scientific evidence. It was based on just like we look up, we kind of look around, it kind of feels like we're stationary and everything's moving around us, right? It's not good scientific evidence, right? And the Bible says so. That's not good scientific evidence, right? But that's basically what geocentrism was based on, right? Just kind of how things look, and the Bible says so. That's not good
Mm-hmm.
science, right? Heliocentrism was based in good science, right? Now, strictly speaking, the first heliocentric theory was wrong. It had a wrong number of planets. It said that the orbits of the planets were perfectly circular, right? Um, and it had the sun at the center of the universe, right? Well, there's more planets than we initially thought. The orbits aren't exactly circular. And A, the sun is not exactly in the center. It wobbles a little bit as gravity pulls it around a
Mm-hmm.
little bit. And B, it's not the center of the universe. It's just the center of the solar system, right? So we add those little tweaks to heliocentrism, right? We say, oh, there's more planets than we thought. We add these little tweaks in there or whatever. But that doesn't mean, oh, well, heliocentrism has been overturned. No, it hasn't. It's just been tweaked. It's been modified as we've come to a better understanding. But the basic idea that the sun's at the center and we revolve around it, right? That's right. And that's still right. And that's never going to be overturned, right?
Right.
We're going to continue to learn things about the solar system and the universe that are going to tweak our theory. Maybe one day we'll even figure out that we're in a multiverse, right? But that's not going to overturn heliocentrism, right? And the
Right.
same thing with like Newton and Einstein. Einstein didn't overturn Newton. Einstein's theory is basically a tweak on Newton's theories, right? And so it is a straw man to pick on science and say, well, why would you believe it now? Because it's just going to be overturned in 10 years anyway. No, it's not. The theory we have now is probably not all the way right, but most of it is right. And all we're going to do is improve upon it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I also wanted to kind of introduce to the discussion not just the tools that we use um, or those type of things, but also the scientists that are putting forth the data. And what I mean by that is we have scientists who are well trained in, say, physics. You have other scientists that might be well trained in um, sports medicine. You're not going to get the same, what's the word I'm looking for? The same quality of data if you are having the sports medicine scientist start doing testing on physics.
Right.
You and the problem is that we see a lot. I've seen a lot of this is that people who are not in their field, just because they have
Mm-hmm.
science as a background in a very general way, extrapolate um, their findings on everything else because they have this I'm a scientist type of a thing,
Right.
and then
Right.
others latch on to that, and oftentimes you have an entity that sees that and ends up kind of purchasing that data, trying to find other people who have that to kind
Right.
of get a consensus of, they all think this way, but it's actually a small subset of scientists, and when you really look at them, they're not scientists in that realm, or
Right.
they've had some type of debunk in their career or something like that. So um, when you're looking at scientific reasoning and you're an average person out there, just the average layperson, what do you suggest for us to do to make sure that when we're looking at even a body of research from that someone puts forth, that you are actually looking at it critically and objectively? How do you think we need to be maybe better at thinking scientifically or reasoning scientifically?
Right. So I think to answer your question, I mean, the short answer to your question, I think, is check credentials and make sure that the person who is talking within the field of their expertise. And today that's pretty easy to do. You can just Google them and figure out what their degree's in and the kind of
Right.
papers they've written, that kind of stuff, right? I'm glad you brought this up because this is actually one of my favorite topics. There's a fallacy called appeal to authority,
Yes.
right? And a lot of people misunderstand that fallacy in thinking that it suggests that anytime you appeal to authority, it's fallacious, right? So if if I say, well, scientist so and so says that that this is the case or whatever, like Michael Mann or whatever, talk about the hockey stick graph, is that warming is whatever. Oh, that's an appeal to authority fallacy. He's an authority, can't appeal to authority. That's a fallacy. No,
Right.
appealing to authority is not a fallacy, right? That's a shorthand. The fallacy is actually more properly called inappropriate appeal to authority. And what it
Mm-hmm.
points at is that there are appropriate times to appeal to authority, and there are inappropriate times to appeal to authority, right? And you got to figure out which one is which, right? When is it appropriate to appeal to authority, and when is it not, right? Um, it is definitely appropriate to appeal to a scientific consensus when the consensus is among relevant experts in the field that they're drawing a conclusion about. It's also not fallacious to appeal to a single authority that has expertise in the area that they have, as long as they're not contradicting the consensus, right? So, for example, if my doctor tells me that I have condition X and not like I think I have condition Y, and they look at me and nope, that's not the right symptoms. You probably have condition X, right? Even if they don't give me all the evidence for that, right? I'm justified in believing them because they're an expert and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not. They have relevant medical knowledge, and they're highly motivated not to lie and get it wrong, because if they do, they could eventually lose their license if they do that enough, right? So there's this
Absolutely.
strong motivation for them to get it right. So that's not an inappropriate appeal to authority. What can be an inappropriate appeal to authority is listening to what a bridge engineer has to say about climate change, right?
Right.
Or a material scientist has to say about whether masks can protect us during COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or what scientific studies, medical scientific studies say at all about anything, right? If they're just a material scientist, right? You can tell me about material science, that's fine, but you can't read and interpret and tell me what conclusions we should draw from medical research. You're not
Right.
qualified to do that, right?
Right.
And pointing that out is so appealing to such an expert would be an fallacious appeal to authority, be inappropriate appeal to authority because they don't have the relevant expertise, right? And if you point that out to someone, they might say, well, that's just an ad hominem. You're personally attacking me, saying that, well, I don't have the expertise, therefore my conclusion's wrong. That's not an ad hominem, right? First of all, like an ad hominem is when you attack the arguer rather than the argument. And usually
Yeah.
you're attacking the argument and then also pointing out that, you don't have the relevant expertise or whatever, right? But it's whether or not you have the relevant expertise is relevant to whether or not I should believe your claim. And so pointing
Mm-hmm.
out that you don't have the expertise is not a fallacy. Let me put it this way. Logical structure, if an argument has a certain kind of structure, if P then Q, P therefore Q or whatever, right? That's a deductive argument. P entails Q and P is true, Q is true. That's deductive, right? That's a valid argument. The validity of that argument doesn't change depending on who gives it. So whether or not the smartest person or the dumbest person in the world says if P then Q, P therefore Q, it's still valid. You can't attack that argument by attacking the character or smartness or whatever of the person who gave it. You certainly can't attack the validity of that argument by who says it, right?
Yep.
But here's the thing. That argument's valid because it's got the right kind of structure, but I have to accept that conclusion only if the premises are true. If it really is the case that P entails Q and P is true, well then yeah, I got to accept Q. But if the premises aren't true, its validity is irrelevant, right? And so here's where the important part comes in, right? Do they have the relevant expertise? Well, are the only reasons you have for thinking that P entails Q and that P is true, or the only reason you have for thinking those premises are true is the word of the person who's giving the argument? Well, then if they're a compulsive liar, that's not an ad hominem. If I point out, yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to accept your premises because you lie all the time.
Right.
It's not an ad hominem. That's a good reason for thinking that the premises are probably false. Or if I point out that, yeah, you say P entails Q, but that's a medical statement and you're a material scientist. That's not a good reason. I don't have a good reason for thinking that's true, right? You're just telling me that it's true. Doubting someone's premises based on the fact that the only reason you have for thinking those premises are true is their word, by looking at the fact that you probably that they're not reliable source of information, that's not an ad hominem.
Right.
That is a legitimate way to critique an argument.
Exactly. It's actually taking data points and coming up with your own conclusion from those data points that are valid. I completely
data
agree
points
with
of like
you.
you're a compulsive liar, or data point of you lack the expertise, whatever.
Right. There's also scientists who have the credentials, but the organization that is funding the research may not be credible. For instance, if you have the Heritage Foundation, who is funding research about, let's say, vaccines, you would have more concern about the validity, regardless of the credentials of those scientists, because the funding that goes behind it. So is there a way to kind of look that piece up, or to try to make sure that we are getting the proper
Yeah.
studies, the proper data.
So, kind of two things to say here. One is quite often when places like the Heritage Foundation get scientists to do research on climate change or whether cigarettes cause cancer, or vaccine, or whatever,
Hmm.
usually they actually don't have the expertise, right? They
True.
actually are getting somebody who has scientists by their name or whatever, but they don't actually have the relevant expertise.
Yes, true.
Occasionally they do, right? Occasionally they will have the appropriate expertise, but then you got to look up where the funding is coming from, and then look at the biases of where the funding is coming from, right? And draw your conclusions appropriately, right? Because money can have
Right.
a big influence, right? And
Absolutely.
when it like comes to climate change denial, a lot of people will go, "Oh, we got to look at the other side too. All these people who are saying climate change is real, like Michael Mann or whatever, they're getting all this money or whatever, and so they're motivated to say it's real too." And that is not the case. That they might accept moderate funding for research, and they get research grants and that kind of stuff, right? But like scientists don't live fat off the hog on research grants. They're not broke.
Exactly.
And the amount of research grants that are out there, there is not enough research grants in the world to be able to pay all of the climate scientists enough to motivate them to all lie, right?
Exactly.
Who does have enough money to pay a handful of scientists to lie is like the oil industry. They are rolling in
Absolutely.
dough. And so it is very easy for them to pony up the money to a few people who are willing to say, yeah, I think climate change is not real or whatever, right? There's so many people that are climate change deniers who are like, follow the money, follow the money. Where does the money go? They're being paid. It's like, who's got the most money in the world? It's not people, it's not environmentalists who
Right.
have all the money in the world. It's the oil companies who don't want us to believe that climate change is real because it will affect their bottom line, who have all the money in the world. And we can trace the funding and see that that's exactly what they've done. They have paid people to deny the science, just like the tobacco industry did when we started realizing
Mm-hmm.
it caused cancer. They did exactly the same thing.
Yep.
The $10 industry. So they paid a few scientists to say that the science wasn't settled because it was going to hurt their bottom line. It's literally the same, and it's the same companies who did it. The same companies
Yes.
who tried tobacco cause cancer are denying that climate change is real. They're just funded by a different, multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. What do you think? It seems like today, both science and critical thinking are becoming almost negative terms, in as not to the people who live in that, but for kind of the, well, a lot of it is those in power that want to remain in power, influencing those who don't have the knowledge base. Not That's not a negative. I'm not saying it's. I'm not calling them stupid. Stupid and just ignorance are two totally separate things.
Right.
But there's people who are actively trying to manipulate their base, or the general people to think that higher education, um, critical thinking, science as a whole are negative. So not only are we having to fight against lower amounts of funding, actual credible good sources of funding to get these studies going, you also are fighting against so many different things. What do you think is the most important thing for us to focus on um, to try to change that tide, or just to be able to survive as a species going into the next
Right.
1,000 years?
Yeah. God, that's really tough. I mean, I think the root cause of most of the world's problem is that lack of critical thinking, that people don't know how to delineate good evidence from bad. Schick says this in the first chapter of his book about how democracies depend on an informed electorate. And if you don't have an informed electorate, con
Right.
artists can come and just bilk people out of their votes and bilk people out of everything, right? And that's exactly what's happened in the last, certainly the last 10 years, but also in the last 50 years. And um, I think that emphasizing the education is the most important part of that, but that's really hard to do because you can do it on an individual basis. That's why I dedicated my life to philosophy rather than going into law where I could have made a bunch more money or whatever, right? Because I think
Right.
it's so important. Education freed my mind and freed me from dogmatism and a whole bunch of harmful things that I believed. And so I wanted to pass that on. So that's why I do that, right? But it's not enough. It's not enough to affect the entire world and change it. And so it's just got to be, I guess, everybody individually trying to do it in that kind of way, right? Is and be maybe the answer is being informed politically. I think that's another big problem is people are not politically informed. They're not politically engaged when it's election day. They don't think about politics until election day, and then they flip a coin, right?
Right.
Not even flip a coin. They just look at like, what's the latest thing that was said or whatever, right? They
Or
look
what
at
did my parents? What did my
what my
parents?
parents do
Yeah.
or what feels right today or whatever.
Or what did my pastor say we need to do? There's so many different people who can influence you if you're not trying to, to think critically.
Right. Or they'll even think back, like, in the last election, think, well, what was it like 4 years ago? I feel pretty good, I guess. So I'll do that. Like, you're not remembering things correctly. It was not great 4 years ago, right? It was pandemic and it was horribleness. And like, there was all these horrible things that happened. You were forgetting what it was like, but you just rely on my memory of something that it was like 4 years ago. Like, well, that's not a reliable memory. This is why everybody thinks that Epstein was arrested under Biden when he was arrested under Trump and he was killed under Trump. And all these kind of wrong assumptions about that whole story happening under Obama and Biden. It all happened under Bush and Trump. But like another scary thing that's also happening is, on the one hand, you're right. People are like, they don't like critical thinking. They don't like science and that kind of stuff, right? But another thing is that our language is being co-opted when we talk about good science and placebo-controlled trials and that kind of stuff. RFK is talking about we want things to be supported by good science, whatever, right? But his definition of good science is completely off and it's inconsistent, right?
Yes.
In one case, he wants, he will demand double-blinded trials that can't be done. I mean, first he lies, like he'll say things like, "There's never been a double-blinded trial done of a vaccine." There's been tons of double-blinded trials that have been done of a vaccine, but he'll want some kind of standard of like, well, it only had 1,000, it needs 10,000 or whatever, right? And so it's just not good enough. So it's not good science. It's not good science because he just raises the bar so high that nothing counts as good science, unless it's something that he wants to believe, and then an anecdote will do.
Right.
Right. Like vaccines cause autism, right? Well, I knew somebody and they got vaccine, they got autism, so vaccines cause autism, right? Well, here's a really good double-blinded study that says that that's not the case. Yeah, well, there wasn't enough participants in it. Like he just draws the line up here. And so they're co-opting our language too. So like, oh no, scientific reasoning is a good thing, but only has how I define what the good scientific reasoning is, right?
Right.
And that's equally dangerous. So we need to stand up against that as well and become scientific literate and understand the difference between like what kind of scientific reasoning is necessary, when are double-blinded trials necessary, when are they not. Again, this is a whole other chapter in the book where I have a whole chapter on how to conduct double-blinded placebo-controlled trials and how that works and why we want to do those and how they're the gold standard and that kind of stuff, right? But I also talk about how they can be abused. Not only can they be abused by p-hacking and people altering the data to make them look like they say something they don't or whatever, right? But people can also misuse them by like demanding that they're necessary when they're not, right? And so not trying to obviously justify conclusions, whenever the conclusions are justified simply because a double-blinded placebo-controlled trial hasn't been done, when ethically or practically it can't be done.
Right.
One of the examples I draw in the book is like you wouldn't want a true double-blinded placebo-controlled trial to determine whether or not bulletproof vests offer any kind of protection.
That's right. Oh my gosh.
Right?
Yes.
You wouldn't do that because the way to do that would be to be 100 people in a room and you get 50 of them bulletproof vests. You get 50 of them vests that look like they're bulletproof, but they're not. And you start shooting and you see who survives, right? Like you can't do that kind of study, but you don't need to, right? I can do that. I can demonstrate they have a protective effect and that they'll have some kind of benefit by putting some on a mannequin and shooting at the mannequin, right? Like physical demonstration is enough for that, right?
Right.
And that, in fact, notice that, and that's enough, even if I did some kind of observational study where I looked out in the world, like, well, let's look at troops with bulletproof vests and without, and let's say I did that and I wasn't able to see a difference in survival rate between the two groups, that would not justify a conclusion that there's the bulletproof vests have no protective effect, because there's too many other confounding factors out in the world, right? Maybe
Absolutely.
the ones with the bulletproof vest get put in the more dangerous situations. Well, like, et cetera, et cetera. Like maybe they saw more battle. Maybe they did, like, there's so many confounding factors there that, like, just the simple physical demonstration is not going to undo, like, the is going the observational study is not going to undo the evidence of a physical demonstration, right?
Hmm.
And we saw this with masks. We saw all the physical evidence that masks do what they need to do to be able to prevent source spread, right? To be able to prevent infected people
Yes.
from droplets and aerosols and that kind of stuff into the air, right? That should be enough to know they have a protective effect. It's not going to be perfect, but like the physical demonstration is enough, right? And then we not only did we have that, but we had like all of these observational studies. It was like, oh look, here's a city that had a mask mandate, and here's one that didn't. And look, the infection rate was lower in the city with one. And here's two states that are different that way. And the state with the mandate. And here's two nations. And here's two like counties. And here's two, like, we could line all that up. And you still had people like, I don't mention his name, saying like, well, but we don't have a double-blinded placebo-controlled trial. Like, you technically can't do that kind of
Yeah.
double-blinded placebo-controlled trial.
Yeah.
But you don't have to, right? To know that that's the case, to know that they have a protective effect. Anyway, so like educating about ourselves about all of those kind of things and being on top of it and correcting people whenever they get
Yes.
it wrong, and doing so in a way that, here's the thing, another piece of scientific reasoning, somebody's in the cult, you're not going to convince them. Don't try to convince them. When you're in online arguments, don't talk to them, talk to everybody else watching the argument, right? Say, notice here that this is the fallacy that they've committed, and this is the problem. The evidence actually says this, and da da da. And then they'll attack you. Don't attack them back. Notice that this is an ad hominem, and that doesn't logically follow, right? The evidence
Right.
is clear. Da, 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 da. Show yourself to be more rational and be speaking to the people who are, because you could change their minds. You're not going to change the cult member's mind, but you can
Right.
change the mind
Absolutely.
of people who are looking at the debate.
Yes, absolutely. Frankly, online debates that are, and I mean like written like on Facebook and those type of things, never go well because of um, the feeling of anonymity. In essence, you're behind a keyboard instead of facing someone. I think that Zoom or YouTube videos, or maybe just meeting someone in person, you can have those types of conversations even with someone in the cult, because at that point when you're facing them you have to think about what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
You have to think about the delivery and the timing and those type of things. All of that is so incredibly important in order to get your point across, and I think that's what we have seemed to lose a little bit of. We've lost a little bit of that, and probably exacerbated by COVID. But I think social media has done wonders for destroying our ability to interact with other human beings.